In this video, we're going to study Lesson 5 in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's English Grammar 1 course, and the subject of Lesson 5 is quotation marks. In our last two lessons, we learned about the sentence and the 4 different kinds of sentences, and then we did some exercises to practice writing the different kinds of sentences. In this lesson, we're going to learn something else about sentences, the use of quotation marks. To get started, we're going to learn the rule about quotation marks, which is pretty simple. Quotation marks should be used in writing when we quote the exact language of another person. Quotation marks should be used in writing when we quote the exact language of another person. Now remember, the rules of grammar are used so that our reader can easily understand what we're writing. So the reason why we use quotation marks is because we want our reader to understand that the words we're saying are the exact words that were said by someone else. And if the words we use were not the exact words, then we don't want to put them in quotation marks. So the reason why we're learning about quotation marks is to show our reader that the words we're writing are the exact language of someone else. All right? When we want to show that, we use quotation marks. Now, we're going to look at some examples. In the Bible we read, "And God said, quote, let there be light," unquote. You hear what I said? I said quote, unquote. When we say what is written, in the writing we can see quotation marks. You can see these marks here and here are quotation marks. These marks show us where the words of another person begin and where the words of the other person end. All right, so the quotation marks, people make a sign like this to show quotation marks. The quotation mark shows where the words begin that are being quoted from another person, and they show where they end. Okay? You can see the quotation marks. "And God said, let there be light." And "let there be light" is in quotation marks. So that means these are God's exact words. Okay, "let there be light." Now, if we quote something, or if we write about what someone else says, but we don't use their exact words, we simply don't use quotation marks. Here's another example. If we were to say the same thing, but not use God's exact words, we could say, "God said that light should appear." God said that light should appear. Those are not his exact words, and so there are no quotation marks. "And God said, let there be light." Those were God's exact words, and therefore they're put between quotation marks. "God said that light should appear" tells us what God said, but doesn't quote his exact words. And so there are no quotation marks. All right? Quotation marks should be used in writing when we quote the exact language of another person. And remember, the quotation marks are for the reader, so they can see that you're quoting the exact words of another person. All right. In Lesson 5, you have some exercises to do, and I'd like to walk through the first 2 exercises with you so that you can see what needs to be done to complete these exercises. That's all that there is in Lesson 5, just an explanation of what quotation marks are and some examples of how they're used. Then you're given some exercises to do, and that's it for quotation marks. Pretty simple lesson. In the exercise, you're given a sentence. And the sentence has the exact words that someone said, but they're not marked with quotation marks. You need to read the sentence, figure out what the words are that were said by the other person, and then put them in quotation marks. Okay? So you need to figure out where the quotation marks should go in these sentences. The first sentence says, "Did your mother send you?" said the merchant gruffly. Did your mother send you? Said the merchant gruffly. A merchant is a person who sells things, and gruffly means he said it kind of roughly. Okay? Did your mother send you? Said the merchant gruffly. So, what did the merchant say? What did the merchant say? The merchant said, "Did your mother send you?" So the merchant asked the question, and he said, "Did your mother send you?" So we want to put the words of the merchant in quotation marks. So the words of the merchant begin here. Did your mother send you? So we're going to put quotation marks here where his words begin. And then we're going to put quotation marks here where his words end. Did your mother send you? Said the merchant gruffly. Quotation marks before his words begin and after his words end. Did your mother send you? Is put in quotation marks. All right, now we have a few other things to look at too, because the rules of sentence making also have to be checked here. When you quote something that someone says, it's usually going to be a sentence that they said. And the sentence that's inside the quotation marks needs to start with a capital letter. So when you quote someone and write the exact words that they said, make sure you look to see that it begins with a capital letter. So here we'll make sure that this D that begins the sentence is a clear capital letter. Did your mother send you? The second problem we see is that the merchant asks a question, and a question has to end with a question mark. So we're going to put the question mark inside the quotation marks. So we're going to write, make this a little clearer here. Did your mother send you? Question mark, then the quotations and a comma. We haven't studied the comma yet, but a comma just shows where there's a pause in the speech. And if you read this, you can hear the pause. And the comma just shows us where that pause is. It helps the reader to not get confused. Did your mother send you? Pause, marked by the comma, said the merchant gruffly. Did your mother send you? Said the merchant gruffly. Okay, the comma just marks a pause. So we have the words of the merchant. They begin with quotation marks. They end with quotation marks. And because the merchant said an interrogative sentence, he asked a question, we put a question mark at the end of his words. Okay? And that's all for number 1 there. Number 2, we read, the general said, be ready to start at 5 a.m. The general said, be ready to start at 5 a.m. The general said, and then his words begin, and they go to the end of the sentence. What did the general actually say? The general said, be ready to start at 5 a.m. So his words right here, be ready, we need to put a quotation mark before the word be. The general said, quotation mark, be ready to start at 5 a.m., period, and we put a quotation mark at the end to show that his words stop there. Okay? And we need to put a period at the end of the sentence outside the quotation marks too. The general said, be ready to start at 5 a.m. This period here marks the end of the general's sentence. This period here marks the end of the whole sentence. So there are two periods. One period is for the whole sentence coming to an end, and one period is for the end of the general's sentence. You see that? Okay? Now, this is a sentence beginning here, and so we need to make this T capital. So there's a capital letter at the start of our sentence, and there's a period at the end of our sentence. But we also have to capitalize the first word of the sentence spoken by the general. So we have to make this B capital, because this is the beginning of another sentence, the sentence that's inside the quotation marks. The general said, comma, shows us a pause. The general says, or said, be ready to start at 5 a.m., period. Quotation marks mark the end of the quote, and then the period marks the end of this whole sentence. Okay? So quotation marks show us that the exact language of another person is being quoted. All right, here we have the exact words of the merchant. Here we have the exact words of the general. And up here we had the exact words of God when he created the light. God said, quote, let there be light. All right? And you've heard me say this a couple times. When we read something like this, where we have quotation marks, if we're reading it to someone and we want them to understand that there are quotation marks in the sentence that we're reading, what we'll say is, we'll say, the general said, quote, be ready to start at 5 a.m., unquote. That's a way for us to show someone that there were quotation marks in the sentence. We say quote at the beginning and unquote at the end. And God said, quote, let there be light, unquote. All right? Quote, did your mother send you? Unquote, said the merchant gruffly. The general said, quote, be ready to start at 5 a.m., unquote. All right? So you'll also see people sometimes say this. They'll say, and God said, quote unquote, let there be light. That's another expression people use. All right? The general said, quote unquote, be ready to start at 5 a.m. So those are two different ways that we show that quotation marks are in a sentence when we read something that's written to other people. But for your lesson here, all you have to understand is that quotation marks should be used in writing when we quote the exact language of another person. If you're not quoting the exact language, you don't need to use quotation marks. And we saw an example here. God said that light should appear. Often the word that is used to show that the words are not the exact language of the person. All right? For example, here we could say, the general said that we should be ready to start at 5 a.m. The general said that we should be ready to get started at 5 a.m. The general said that we should get up at 5 a.m. The general said that we should be dressed and ready to go at 5 a.m. When I say the general said that, then I usually don't quote the exact words that were said. And God said that there should be light. Those are not the exact words. And God said, quote, let there be light, unquote, exact words. So we can show this in writing. We can also show this in speech when we're reading something that's written where there's quotation marks. Okay? That's all for lesson 5, just the lesson on quotation marks. Make sure you know how to make quotation marks. Make sure on your computer you know how to type quotation marks. Okay, that's important too. You should know when to use quotation marks, when you don't need to use quotation marks. Do the exercises and practice so that you can get some practice using quotation marks, and also make sure you follow all the other rules for sentence making when you do those exercises. And that's it for lesson 5. One last thing, now that you learn about quotation marks, when you're reading books, pay attention to quotation marks, because now you understand what they're for. When you see those quotation marks in a book, you know that the exact language of someone is being quoted, all right? And also look for examples where something that someone said is being spoken of, but there are not quotation marks because it's not the exact language of the other person. Keep an eye out for those things as you read, because your grammar will help you to read better. And now that you're able to read and you know what to look for in the reading, your reading will help you to understand grammar better, because you'll see examples of it in all different writings that you see in your reading. All right, so that's all for lesson 5 on quotation marks. I hope that's helpful. If you have any questions or would like to discuss anything else, just contact us. We're always here to help. God bless your studies.